Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this special meeting of the Arts, Parks, and Neighborhoods Committee. Today is Wednesday, February 1st, 2012, and it is now 1:10 p.m. We're ready to get started. I'm not sure if we'll be joined by Mr. Reyes and Mr. Wesson, as council, I believe, is still in session. But we're ready to begin. So we will be taking general public comment today at the conclusion of the agenda items. And it is likely to be kind of a lengthy discussion today because we have 4 significant matters on the agenda. And this will be my last opportunity to consider them in this committee. So I want to make sure that we spend as much time as we need to fully discuss them. So with that, let's, Mr. Powell, let's call item number 1, please.
Item number 1 is the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment Report in response to motion Krikorian-Smith relative to the Neighborhood Council System Training Program.
All right. Mr. Kim, welcome.
Good afternoon, Councilman.
We've been on a long journey on these reform motions that are before us today, and I want to thank you and the department for your work on this. If you can, please, let's start with item number 1 and talk about what your recommendations are so far with regard to the training program.
Thank you. Bangwan Kim, General Manager, Department of Neighborhood Empowerment, and I'm accompanied by Gracie Liu, Senior Project Coordinator, who was lead staff on preparing these reports and working with the neighborhood councils. So the brief background on the motion was to report back on the training system for neighborhood council board members and following up on the series of town halls that you conducted, Councilman, that there was a lot of concern expressed by board members about the inconsistency of training that was provided to neighborhood council board members. And so we requested us to come back with some recommendations about how we could address the gaps that currently exist. Generally, for all of the motions that you requested report backs on, the process we followed was identical, in that we worked firstly with the regional alliances and pretty much were listening to what they had to say about the motions. That was followed up by work groups around each of the 4 motions. So we did a little deeper dive in terms of each of the motions to get more substantive responses from the neighborhood councils. We then posted the draft reports on our web blog and publicized that and asked for public comment as well. So we really did, and I'd like to thank Gracie for taking lead on this, that it was really a robust public participation process that, much like the town hall process that you convened, that we strongly believed that a robust public participation process was very important in any of the major reforms that we would undertake for the neighborhood council system. So some other background on the training issues. Other than the funding training that is required of the Department of Neighborhood Council treasurers and second signatories, there are no consequences for board members not getting training. The state-mandated ethics training is required by state law, but because that's a state law, there aren't any consequences that are implementable at the state level. I am pleased to report, though, that because the department has been emphasizing the importance of taking ethics, we'll be releasing data at the end of this month that shows a pretty significant compliance rate among the board members, among the some 1,800 board members, in complying with the state-mandated ethics test.
And I'm sorry, before you move on from that point, the ethics training that's currently mandated by state law incorporates Brown Act compliance and Public Records Act compliance and other legal mandates on government agencies, does it?
That's correct. The Ethics Commission online video training is what we offer to board members. So what the elected officials and appointed members of the city government are required to take is what neighborhood councils take.
So there's uniformity across the board among,
Right.
you know, staff members,
Correct.
city council members, neighborhood commission board members.
Yes. And there's a secondary training that we developed that's specific to neighborhood councils, and that was done in cooperation with the city attorney's office. We basically videotaped a 2-hour workshop that the city attorney conducted, and that content is really specific to neighborhood councils. So we provide those through our regional workshops, and that's accompanied by a quiz, which we have yet to finalize, but we've already received approval from the Ethics Commission that would be a viable substitute for the state mandated ethics test. The two focusing questions that we ask for the work groups is what courses, if any, should be mandated. There are a range of kind of core competencies, if you will, that we have found to be very helpful in helping neighborhood councils engage meaningfully with their stakeholders. But the two that we might want to think about it on two levels. One is what should absolutely be mandated, and then what are the others that are important but should not be mandated but still would be helpful. So I think it might be helpful for you, councilmen, to think about it on those two levels, because obviously the more controversial one is what is mandated and what would then be the consequences. There were a range of options that were suggested in terms of consequences. One would be rewriting the plan so that the department can determine the consequences. Secondly, the consequences could be determined by the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners via a policy, because they're responsible for passing policies that affect the neighborhood councils. The third was neighborhood councils can determine consequences in their bylaws. And there are a few neighborhood councils who've adopted some best practices. For example, Panorama City, actually Tony's in the audience. What they do is they withhold certain benefits of neighborhood council board members until they comply with the state-mandated ethics test. So things like the business card, which I think is a coveted item among some board members, are withheld until they comply. Some board members, the president reads out the roster at every board meeting and makes it a public disclosure item. So there is leadership that's happening at the neighborhood council level. There are some boards that actually have incorporated in their bylaws that unless they take the state-mandated ethics test, their voting rights will be withheld or suspended, mainly focusing on funding, the use of public funds, and land use issues, because that's where most of the potential conflict of interest issues could arise. The groups also talked about the availability of training and the quality. So they were saying, don't just require us to take training, but make it engaging and make it accessible. It's hard for volunteers who are spending countless hours running their board meetings to also be required to go out and take mandated training that is hit or miss in terms of whether people are getting something out of it. The department currently offers training in a variety of ways. We organize regional quarterly trainings, workshops, whereby we work with the city attorney, and we provide the ethics training that way. We also go provide funding training for all of the neighborhood councils on a regional basis, on a regular basis, whether it's monthly or sometimes it's quarterly. We also have training videos on our website. One opportunity for collaboration with the city department that could help us address the resource question is I recently learned that the personnel department has a system called the learning management system. It's basically a web-based video training program that they use to make sure that all city appointeds and staff are in compliance with the laws in terms of mandatory training, which includes a tracking system, which would be very helpful for us. So we are actually in discussions with them about how to focus the ethics training on that. The second content matter had to do with workplace violence and sexual harassment. So as all city employees are required to take sexual harassment training, and while neighborhood council board members aren't considered employees of the city, they are elected representatives and do represent kind of city-sanctioned or city-blessed. They are city entities, in effect. So city attorney has advised that the possibility of including that would help reduce some of the potential liability that exists out there with board members not really knowing what the rules are around those two particular issues. Implementation costs. As I mentioned before, if the personnel department were able to partner with us, that would probably be the most cost-effective way. I'm told that they could house the video if the department wanted to pay for the generation of the video, the content development, as long as it complied with their technical requirements, that they could accommodate our needs. So I think that if we focused,
If I may, how does that differ from the current scenario in which you have a number of those training videos on your own website?
Right.
What's the difference in practical effect and in cost? and
Practically, we don't have an automated tracking system, which is the biggest problem. So people, what we currently do is they'll watch our video on our website, or they'll take the Ethics Commission website, and then they have to manually notify us, fax us, or email us, and then we return a certificate of completion. So there's in any manual system, there's likelihood for mistakes to be made, and it takes up more staff time. But by the personnel department offering these trainings on their platform, it would automate the entire process, which would make it more consistent and less staff time intensive. And that concludes my report on the training motion.
Okay. I appreciate your report and the outreach that you've done to draw input from stakeholders and board members on this. It seems to me that the mandatory training elements that all neighborhood council board members should be obligated to participate in would be those areas in which there's either a statutory mandate or where the city faces liability. And to me, those would be the ethics training, sexual harassment training, and the funding program for all board members. I think it's inadequate to expect just the treasurer to be obligated to do this, because in order to have realistic self-enforcement within a board, I think it's important that all of the board members understand the elements of the funding program and checks and balances in the system, so that they will be able to internally detect any problems that there may be, and so that everyone can be on the same page in understanding how the funding program works, how it is appropriately utilized, and so on. I think that will actually relieve a lot of internal problems within neighborhood councils if everybody's on the same page. I think those, to me, would be the areas that jump to mind immediately as places where the city is actually exposed to a loss, whether because of liability or loss of taxpayer funds. So, in my view, those should be mandated training programs. I think we need to continue to work on an accountability mechanism. Excuse me, both for monitoring and enforcement. So I'm heartened by the possibility that through personnel's system we may be able to have an actual tracking system. That's great. There also now needs to be a regimen of consequences for those who don't comply. And I think that some of the best practices that you described are excellent, and I hope that all of our councils will adopt those. But I think there needs to be some additional measure so that the city knows and the stakeholders know that their board members are in fact in compliance. And I think rather than my trying to figure out exactly what that mechanism should be right now, although I think there should be an opportunity for cure with 60 days notice or something with an opportunity for cure, and then loss of voting rights after that. I don't see anything less than that being adequate to actually enforce these. And for the vast majority of board members who don't need any enforcement mechanism at all, they just know that this is part of their responsibility and they do it, it's unfair to them to have the few people who don't want to be bothered get away with it. And so I think we really do need to have a system like that. I think what we should do with this matter, well, I'm going to hear from the public on it first before I reach a conclusion on it. Is there anything that you wanted to add on this, Gracie? Okay. So then let's go to public comment on number 1, and I'd like to call up. Yeah, thank you. Thanks. I'd like to call up first Ivan Spiegel, and then Ida Talala. And then I have a number of people, Mr. Bailey, Mr. Wilkinson, and one card that has no name on it that lists all items. So shall I just, I don't know. So shall I just call each of those as we get to each item then? It's just saving paper? Okay, very good. So, very good. Mr. Spiegel, welcome.
Okay, and first of all, I'd like to thank you for all the work you've done this last year, helping neighborhood councils. I hope you'll continue to do that when you get to the budget committee, because we will need you there too. I'm totally in favor of this. I do trainings. I've been going around the city doing orientations. I think a lot of the problems that come in the system is because people just don't know any better. Councils lose their funding because they don't know what they're spending money on, and then it turns out they can't. I would like to see added to this a basic board orientation of 2 or 3 hours. When it could happen when you're running for the board, or it could happen right before you take your seat. Those are really the ideal ways to do it. People have to know what they're walking into, because for the most part, they have no clue. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Ida Talala, followed by Tony Wilkinson.
My name is Ida Talala. I would like to thank the chairman also for his work and for the fact that he has showed up for so many meetings alone. I think it's really wonderful.
Thank you.
And all the best when you take up your next position. I am appalled that it has taken done 10 years to arrive at this point. I really think that your suggestion is an excellent, that funding accountability be taken by all, because it is a basic responsibility of all board members, and they are absolutely clueless. In the Greater Echo Park Elysian Neighborhood Council, the president did the budget allocation all by himself, then presented it to the board on the eve on when it was supposed to expire, and got the vote and carried it to bank. I think that that kind of action is absolutely to be condemned. This is a function of the full board, the elected representatives working with stakeholders. The training should impart in each of these elected officials the responsibility to be accountable to your community. This is not a frat club. This is not a private organization or club. This is city activity. You cannot have 2 years in which you can then maybe take the training, maybe not. No consequences. 3 months in taking your office, you should be trained. I am sorry to see such lax attitude from both the city attorney and Dunn.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Tony Wilkinson, followed by Glenn Bailey.
Hi, Tony Wilkinson from Panorama City. This is sort of you're torn between two things here. I certainly agree that things that you've suggested are basic needs to have everyone share a common base. One of the reasons that the Neighborhood Council in Panorama City didn't go to you can't vote if you fail to take ethics, for example, is we didn't see any authority in the charter or the plan in order to do so. And we think there's going to have to be some kind of modification before you actually take away the right of a person. So that's one of the frustrations. But the other thing that we also need to look at is when we mandate training, and I hope it's a very small subset, like you indicated, that's critical, we have to make certain that the training is easily available and available frequently enough so it's not such a challenge to have to get what you need to operate. This is part of the problem, because what we're doing out there is we're competing with other organizations, chambers of commerce, industry associations, apartment associations, for the best and the brightest in the community. And when we start putting barriers to entry that aren't easy to fulfill, there are a lot of people that we really need in neighborhood councils that will go somewhere else. So we have to be careful that we're not structuring it so that we get maybe the people who are willing to put up with stuff, and you know, we need to be able to get the best guys, and so delivering the service is part of the mandate. Thank you.
Thank you. Because the most responsible people will overcome those hurdles, and those who may not be responsible enough on their own to take it might be intimidated by those hurdles. Good point. Our next speaker is Glenn Bailey, followed by Anonymous, who I assume to be Mr. Epper. You did. Mr. Bonk. Mr. Bonk. Dr. Bonk, Professor Bonk. Mr. Bailey, welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairman Kikorian. Thank you also for your outstanding leadership of this committee during your tenure. And look forward, I know it's more of a challenge to be dealing with budget and finance, but I'm sure you'll do a great job. So in terms of your recommendations, if that were a Facebook post, I would click like on it because it was exactly right on. On the ethics, you know, the state law provides that you have to take the ethics within 1 year of taking office. And so for neighborhood councils that only theoretically serve for 2 years, I mean, that's ridiculous. Half the term, you not have to require it. So I hope that there's ability in the city to have tighter standards than the state law. In fact, at the June, I think it was the June Bonk meeting, it was either said at Bonk or announced through an email at blast that by the end of September there would be an enforcement plan associated with ethics. But unfortunately, the last posting of the ethics compliance, those who have taken the current training, the last updated version of that, I believe, is August. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it should be real time. I've taken the ethics training in person as well as online, and I never had to do anything other. You know, I didn't have to fax anything in the department. It just happened, and I guess I was lucky that there were no glitches. But that should be real time and updated so that every neighborhood council knows who is in compliance, when they expire, and the president or the officers make sure that they stay in compliance. I couldn't find it on the website even as of yesterday, that status, and it needs to be there, and it needs to be updated as the trainings come in. The funding is very important. Every board member collectively has a fiduciary responsibility to the spending of city monies, and I'm not saying it has to be the full treasurer's training, but it has to be at least enough to know what the requirements are, and often enough to accommodate any changes from the department. And as far as loss of voting rights, I agree that it should be. You shouldn't punish the people who are in compliance, but certainly you don't want to have people voting on land use issues who may have conflicts of interest and they haven't taken ethics, and you don't want them voting spending city money if they haven't taken that training at a minimum. Thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner Epperhart.
I have to learn to frame remarks in case something appears before the commission. So this is going to be sort of generic. First thing, the commission adopted a work plan, just to let everybody know, at its last meeting, and one of the components of that work plan is to really work on a leadership development program for neighborhood councils, and committees were set up to do that in conjunction with neighborhood councils and the department. So we're all trying to work together now. With regard to training, education, mandatory, not mandatory, we need to remember there's a very broad range of individuals who serve with neighborhood councils across this city. For some, it is very easy to go online, take the training, and get current. For others, they don't have a computer. You know, they may have to go to the library. Some don't speak English adequately to take the training that's offered in English. I don't think it's available in other languages yet. That is a problem. So what I would urge is, before we jump on consequences, that we make sure we have systems in place that are available to the broad range of folks who serve in neighborhood councils. We talk about diversity, but the thing that works against it more than anything else is how difficult we make it to be a neighborhood council volunteer. And I know there are a lot of folks in a lot of neighborhoods in the city who walk in the door and the first thing they get hit with is 5 or 6 hours of mandatory training. We're going to have to do some real work to overcome that. So that would be my comment, is be careful, take everybody into consideration, and make sure the systems are in place before we start punishing people for not complying. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Any comments from the department on any of the points raised? Okay, well, here's what I would like to see happen, and I want to discuss how we make it happen. I would like to see mandated training dealing with the areas that I mentioned. So ethics, Brown Act, public disclosure requirements, sexual harassment, and the funding program. I would like to see stakeholders be given an opportunity, given notice, an opportunity to cure if they're not in compliance with that mandate. And then I would like to see an enforcement mechanism that follows that, which I believe should be personally directed at the stakeholder and not directed at the neighborhood council as a whole, like suspension of funding or something like that. My view is that that should be a suspension of voting rights. Further to some of the public comments, which I think were extremely well taken, and by the way, I'm very pleased to hear that Bonk is working now on developing the broader range of training, because that one of the things I was going to suggest is I'd also like to see the department come forward with suggestions about how we can broaden the availability of the non-mandatory training in areas like leadership, procedures in meetings, city government basics, how to conduct an effective meeting, community organizing, some of the things that are really important for stakeholders to know, but which aren't appropriate for a mandate. I think the department's already gone far in providing those resources on the website with the videos and so forth, but I'd like to see what more we can do, including the general overview training that incoming new board members get. Just as a little diversion here, when I was elected to the state legislature, we had something called Hertzberg University, which was a training program for new state legislators that was created under Speaker Hertzberg, and it was everything, from the basic stuff of how a bill becomes a law to, how you work your bill through the legislature, all of the sort of ethics things that weren't necessarily statutorily mandated, interaction with constituents, all of those sorts of things that are fundamental tools of legislators. We actually had a formal training for new legislators. That was a new thing. A few years ago, they didn't have even that, and I think that's where we are with neighborhood councils. Many people come into this task extremely qualified for it, but many people are, very well-intentioned, but just don't have the background and the training to be able to sort of hit the ground running, and I think that needs to be a part of it too. The department's implementation plan for this training ought to take into account ease of compliance with the mandatory training. And to Mr. Eberhardt's point, I think that needs to include, where necessary, accessibility issues, language issues, accommodation of socioeconomic differences, availability of internet access, all of those things. We need to have an implementation plan that takes into account those things. Otherwise, we can't realistically hold somebody accountable if they're at a disadvantage in complying with our mandate in the first place. So that's what I would like to see happen. And I would like to make that recommendation to council. What I need a little help on is whether that will require an ordinance, whether there will need to be a suggested charter amendment. I hope that we won't need to do those things, but I'm looking to you, Mr. Kim, and if you have suggestions offhand as to what vehicles will be necessary to have council actually make that change, or is it simply an instruction to the department?
We could certainly draft some language reflecting your recommendation. I would recommend that the city attorney be involved in figuring out the mechanics of whether an ordinance or a charter change and which path would be the best way to get where you want to go.
Okay. So then why don't we, I think the simple way to do it for now, just so that we keep the ball moving forward, is for me to make these recommendations to council, specifically to recommend that the council instruct the department to work with the city attorney's office to effectuate a training plan that will encompass all of the elements that I just described. Does that work? Wait, bring it back to this committee or to council? Yeah, I think that's the way to go. So does that make sense? Clear? Okay. All right. Thank you very much. So that brings us to item number 2.
Now we'll defer to Gracie Liu, who spent most of the time with the neighborhood councils on this process.
Item number 2 is a done report in response to motion Krikorian-Smith relative to a neighborhood council system grievance system and associated policies and process.
Good afternoon. Gracie Liu, Senior Project Coordinator for the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment. For this process, in terms of receiving feedback from the neighborhood councils, exactly similar to what General Manager Kim mentioned before. The issue with grievances is currently grievances go directly to the neighborhood council. There's a separate system called complaints that come to the department. It has been rather confusing for almost everyone involved, the difference between the two. Complaints ultimately can lead to decertification of the neighborhood council. Grievances generally stay with the neighborhood council. It can develop into a complaint, but again, it has been confusing. And when we were looking at this process, it was to try to address clarity in those two issues, and in doing so, the work group that worked on the grievances decided to combine grievances and complaints into one system that would basically start at the department but go back to the neighborhood council for resolution in order to respect self-governance of neighborhood councils so that they get the first crack at trying to solve the issue. If that doesn't work, it comes back to the department and goes into a peer grievance panel that will be regionally based. That's kind of the simplified version of it. There are other recommendations in terms of some people were like, just get rid of grievances entirely because there's an election process. That's what that's supposed to be for. Others suggested taking grievances to the commission, the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners. The issue with doing that is that any review that they would, or any finding that they would make could actually ultimately be taken to the city council for review as well. So we thought that that process might be a little cumbersome. I can get into more of the flow chart of the whole grievance process they developed, because this is a very simplified version of it. Unless you have other questions you want to direct me to.
I was going to ask you about that actually, because as I understood it, the department's role upon the filing of the grievance is more the administrative one of monitoring it. So the
Correct.
grievance goes to the neighborhood council board for resolution. If there's no satisfaction with that resolution, then it comes back to the department for purpose of being then referred to the regional peer grievance panel. So it's not like the department plays an active role in resolution other than to
Right.
monitor it and to assign it.
Correct. We're shuffling the paper. We're just keeping track and making sure that it follows a timeline, which we estimated to be about 90 days from once we receive it to determine that's a valid grievance, and then sending it back to the neighborhood council. That ultimately, within 90 days, there would be some type of resolution, either at the neighborhood council level or at the regional grievance panel level.
Okay. And then there was also a recommendation that following the regional peer grievance panel, there could be, if I understood correctly, there could be a referral to bonk
Correct.
if there was a finding of some intentional malfeasance.
Right. There's definitely one of the proposals that came out of the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners did include either to the commission a secondary appeal process or another neutral third party, not necessarily the commission. I think ultimately, though, the work group kind of wanted it to be resolved at the peer grievance panel level because there are. If you see on page 3 of the report, there were consequences that they could use as a vehicle to remedy the grievance, but which I assume that the commission could potentially look at as well if there was an issue that the regional grievance panel came up with.
How are the regional grievance panels constituted?
This actually kind of spills into the regional governance motion. We were looking at creating something that was based on some type of regional system. It could be the existing planning areas, but because there was this motion proposing regional governance, we were thinking that perhaps it could be based on that. And looking at those regions, it would probably be maybe even more than the current 7 planning areas. The neighbor councils within a region would propose their candidates to sit on the regional grievance panel, and when a grievance came before the panel, the department would assist in making sure that those selected for the panel would not have any conflicts of interest. It could be just a board member or stakeholder that's recommended to the panel, or there was some talk of even perhaps allowing council member staff or other governments or city staffing to be included as well.
We don't have a representative of the city attorney's office today, do we? What comments did the city attorney's office provide on these sorts of proposals?
I think their concern basically would be how to empower the regional grievance panel, and there could potentially have to be some type of ordinance to allow for that. I think there, ultimately they wanted to see what the consequences would be and how that would affect the neighborhood council, and depending on how it affected the neighborhood council, that would determine how much a degree of ordinance or just as city council providing language to us, what would be involved in that.
Okay. And from the department's perspective, with this kind of a system, with a regional peer grievance panel and the flow chart that you described, have you been able to assess what the administrative demands for that would be likely to be on the department, what the budgetary requirements, personnel requirements are for that? Is there adequate infrastructure?
Right.
What the tracking mechanisms would be? What would be involved from the department's perspective?
Right. So this system that the work group came up with is, we expect that existing staff could not take on, maintenance without at least bringing on at least one more staff person. We were looking, I think, at a project coordinator level, so that there could be decision making on that staff's, to have that staff have the ability to make decisions when it comes to the regional peer grievance panels. I know General Manager Kim has spoken to, has heard of another possible option that we have not yet vetted through the neighborhood councils, because it only came up recently. So I don't know if you want to speak to
And
that.
this is a possibly a more cost-effective option. And as Gracie mentioned, it only came up to light recently because we were looking at the issue of election challenges and how we might handle those in preparation for the council motion that you led, in terms of possibly transferring the elections back to the department. And I learned that the Civil Service Commission has a pool of professional arbitrators who could possibly be used as as basically the hearing officer for addressing election challenges. So that resource could actually be plugged into this grievance system, and that would actually be, there's pros and cons. From a cost perspective, it would clearly be more cost effective because there'd be less staff time involved in terms of recruiting the volunteers, screening them, making sure they're trained. There's quite a bit of staff work involved in doing that in terms of getting the right personnel, the right volunteers in place for a peer-to-peer system. Arbitrators would be pretty much plug and play, and I was just talking to one of the persons who do that, and they said it's a pretty streamlined process where you just get the two parties in the room, they state their case, and the arbitrator issues a decision whether that person is responsible for what kind of authority that position would have. Has to be worked through. But that person could either issue a recommendation to the department to implement. That probably makes the best sense. But that's a more streamlined option that it's possible to investigate as a more cost-effective option.
And they may not even be mutually exclusive. You could do a peer grievance panel, a regional panel, and then the arbitrators could be the last resort option if there's not satisfaction with the grievance panel, for example. The problem with an arbitrator is, yes, they're plug and play, and they do this all day, and they resolve disputes, and they're really very good at that. But they may not speak the language of neighborhood councils. They may not understand, this unique hybrid form of governance that we've created here. They may not understand. I mean, all of us struggle to try to figure out how to, apply principles to this kind of hybrid thing. So it might be a little bit challenging for somebody to come to that cold in order to resolve grievances. But maybe after a couple of rounds of grievance resolution through the neighborhood council itself and then the regional panel, that might be an appropriate last option, rather than putting that burden on Bonk's shoulders and potentially even the city councils.
I think that's probably the best way to think about it, is explore both avenues, and they could probably work in a complementary way. The con side of going that way that I heard from neighborhood councils that resonated with me is that they were looking at the grievance process as a way for people to learn how to avoid getting into those situations. So in a way, they saw it as a learning opportunity, so that the findings and the claims would be recorded by the department and would be posted on our website. So it could be, I could see that as having some validity, that people could learn, this is the way to avoid getting into those kinds of situations, and it could become a more of a learning resource as opposed to a following more of the judicial path about who's right and wrong.
Okay. Sorry if I took you off track.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Do you have anything else?
I don't.
The last piece, I think, from the city attorney was, and I think that this would be our recommendation too, is to collapse the grievance and complaint process into one. It's very confusing for a lot of stakeholders. They don't make the distinction. Not everybody's a lawyer out there. So collapsing those two and then funneling it into a more cohesive process, I think, does have a lot of value in terms of resolving a lot of the, I call hanging chads out there that tend to infect the system in a negative way.
Well, I am a lawyer, and I've chaired this committee for 2 years, and it was only when I read this report that I really understood that there was a distinction. So I think it makes a great deal of sense to do exactly that and to make it a single process. I've been joined now by the Honorable Ed Reyes. Mr. Reyes, welcome. Good to have you here. We're on item number 2, dealing with grievances. I think I've exhausted my questions. If you wish, Mr. Reyes, if you'd like to offer some comments or questions now, or I can go to public comment. Which is your
public comment's fine.
Okay. So why don't we go to the cards on number 2, and we'll start with Commissioner Eberhardt. No, pass on this one? Okay.
I have no grievances.
Attaboy. Okay, then we'll go. Our next speaker will be Tony Wilkinson, followed by Glenn Bailey.
Tony Wilkinson from Panorama City. This area of grievances is actually an area where, the way I see it, according to the charter and the plan, Dunn has awesome powers. The problem is that Dunn doesn't have a large staff to exercise those awesome powers. And also the other challenge is that the only remedy under exhaustive efforts is decertification. And so then Dunn is very hesitant to get into that whole process because of the ultimate, and it goes to Bonk, which is the executioner. The whole idea of a regional grievance process was an idea that Dunn could actually trust or not certain regional groups depending on what Dunn thought their capacity was in terms of their ability to have some control or powers to force a neighborhood council into a situation to correct the remedy. And basically have a good cop, bad cop thing. So that if you had an effective set of people trying to resolve a grievance who were peers, but not interested peers, they could probably cajole a neighborhood council into cooperation more easily than setting up an adversarial relationship with Dunn. Because, of course, they didn't work it out together. Then what happens is either you go to an arbiter or you go to Dunn. So to the extent that regional panels had the capacity, to that extent, they would be able to serve as staff replacements for Dunn staff that doesn't exist anymore, without so much, basically they don't have the power and they don't need to have it formally. They just have to have the understanding that if you don't do what the regional panel suggests, then you're going to go to the guy who really has the power. So that was the general thought, is to make up for the staff that Dunn doesn't have to exercise its awesome powers.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Glenn Bailey, followed by Ida Talala.
Glenn Bailey, board member on the Encino Neighborhood Council, speaking as an individual. First of all, I totally support the combining of the current 2 dual process of grievances and complaints into just one. It is confusing even for people who've been involved in the process, and certainly just stakeholders or people who haven't been. So that's very important. Secondly, one of the deficiencies that I've seen in the current system is that people file their grievances to the neighborhood council presently and their complaints to Dunn presently, although most people don't know about the complaint part of things. And the problem that I've seen more often than not is that the neighborhood council, when they get a grievance, they just ignore it. They sit on it. They like file it and just hope it goes away. And so I think first of all, and I totally, if it's required to do an ordinance, I hope that you will move to instruct city attorney to draft an ordinance along these lines. That it be required that this grievance/complaint all be filed with done, so there is this tracking process. So there is some accountability to make sure that the neighborhood council does take its 60 days or whatever to review it and take any action, and then it can go on through the process. There has to be that tracking there, and that's been big deficiency. So, I read the resolution passed by the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners on September 6th of 2011. It sounds pretty good. I've also participated in the working group, and there was this flow chart that was developed, which also looks pretty good. There's some, I think, minor variations, but basically provides for a 60-day review opportunity for neighborhood councils before it goes to the regional level. And I can go with the area planning, or I can go with, like, for the valley, a valley-wide, but I think maybe the regional planning, it's known, I think that's fine. But it's real important, I think, that we do set direction if an ordinance is made, that you start that process for drafting. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ida Talala, followed by Ivan Spiegel. Ms. Talala.
My name is Ida Talala. I live in the Echo Park area that is served by the Greater Echo Park Aleutian Neighborhood Council. I have filed grievances one after the other, only to have them not heard. A grievance that is out there for 4 years is an absurdity, and I blame Dunn for it. I also think that this inability of Dunn to respond responsibly to stakeholders is a liability for community. We had filed signature cards, etc., for the decertification of the neighborhood council in June of 2009. Nothing came about it. Miss Gracie Liu wrote and said, in 6 months this will be dealt with. Today, it's February 2012. What happened in the interim? What happened was it was taken, the neighborhood council was asked whether it had dealt with the grievance. The neighborhood council said yes. That was the end of it. We only learned of it because I was at a bunk meeting. To me, this is irresponsible. As for peer review, a neighborhood council that is a member of a regional council acts on a commission, runs around with all the groups that we don't know, and are at meetings in a lovey-dovey club atmosphere. What chance does the ordinary stakeholder have in filing a grievance where the peer review is tainted? We need an unbiased group. Also, there are legalities involved that we cannot get any assistance from the city attorney's office, but the neighborhood council can. This is placing the ordinary stakeholder at a grave disadvantage, and I really object to it, and I would like to see it addressed.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Reyes, did you want to add anything on the
No.
issue?
No.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Spiegel. I've already moved your card, and I forgot to call you. I'm so sorry.
Okay, I'm really in favor of this. I think they're right. We have to combine the grievances and the complaints because it's very confusing. People don't know about it. I'd also like to see a sentence limiting the amount of grievances that an individual can file against a specific council in a year. We have one guy that filed 21 in one day. So we need a little bit of protection from that. In terms of the rest of it, I think all of this will work. The important thing is we get moving on it. It started 3 years ago at the Congress there was a group that came together about they wanted to standardize the bylaws, and everybody screamed, no, 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 no. But what we do want is a grievance procedure for the city. Right now, you can only file a grievance against your board. And then the board gets to pick the people that are going to hear the grievance, or they hear it themselves. I mean, obviously, that's not the way to go. Who's going to vote against themselves? So this takes it out of the board level. We could each, if you divide in areas, we could each elect one person to randomly serve on these panels. You could bring in ex-judges. You know, I don't care how that part of it is done. What I'm urging you to do here is enough talk. Bonk already approved it. Dunn already approved it. Let's get this going. Please help us out here.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Reyes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to phrase this question, understanding the context, which is a huge volume of work coming at you, a large range of issues, limited staff. But when I hear one of the speakers refer to a case, a grievance, and the way it was characterized, I was hoping you might give us some feedback or look at how we can respond to the assertion. Ms. Talala mentioned a 4-year or 5-year wait. Could you address that in one form or another?
Well, I'd invite Grace to offer her comments too, because she works more directly with it. But my sense is, I mean, the structural problems in terms of the way that the plan was written and the ordinance puts the department in the position of being the judge and jury to resolve complaints. Grievances, as the way the ordinance is written, are going to the neighborhood council. So there's really not a clean process by which the department can resolve these matters. Typically, what you would expect would happen if somebody complained to the department about a neighborhood council is that we would launch an investigation, which is a resource problem for us because we don't have the staff to investigate. So I think the purpose of this ordinance is very important to address people like Ms. Talala, is that there has to be a process that has some integrity and some conclusion, and this proposed remedy would go a long way to resolving it. The department really is in a kind of rock and a hard place when we're charged with both being the advocate for neighborhood councils, but at the other hand, we have a meat cleaver, so that it sends and it's a very difficult role for staff to play. And I think it's inappropriate for city staff to sit there as a judge and jury, in a system that's trying to promote as much grassroots democracy as possible.
Right. Anything else?
In regards to Ms. Talala's statements, I think that her frustration shows the problem with the existing system. When grievances are filed against a neighborhood council and the neighborhood council is resolving the grievances, it kind of seems, perception-wise, to be a conflict of interest because those who are supposedly being grieved about are the ones who are deciding the grievance. So I think that with this new proposal of a regional grievance panel, that this would actually help Ms. Talala in her grievances against her particular neighborhood council.
So, and I realize we're learning as we go along.
Right.
This is a new frontier for many of us. But do you think that in the near future we can get a sense of a structure and time frames that speak to the objectives of this new feature that we are considering today? Is there going to be some format that allows us to reinforce the integrity you spoke of and instill confidence in that this is meaningful as opposed to just a posture or a gesture?
Right.
Is there anything like that in your minds at this stage, or is it too early to ask?
Well, when the work group put together the flow chart for how grievances should be handled, they did consider a lot of these issues, and I think I'm rather confident that if this grievance system were to be implemented, that it would resolve a lot of the existing problems.
But in terms of a product that can come back to this committee? It speaks
It's-
to some structure, timeframes. Is that possible?
Yes, it's actually the basic structure of it is in the report, and the more detailed flow chart I can attach in a supplemental report.
Well, I was actually a little unclear on the recommendation in the report too, because there is a conclusion that describes a need for continuing discussion in the work group, but attached to that is the bonk resolution as well as the South LA draft resolution. So in that accumulation of material, what specifically is the department's recommendation to the committee?
I think we were providing a range of options for the committee to consider, because the flow chart, what the work group came up with, is pretty detailed. I think the issue with the South Los Angeles's recommendation and the commission's recommendation, if they were to be the final, secondary appeal process, is whether or not the committee feels that city council would want to have, the ability to review grievances that are appealed from the commission. So I think it's just something for the committee to consider.
But to make, I'm sorry, Council, but to make a informed decision, do we have enough understanding of the number of cases, the scale of work? Because that's more time added to our committee work.
Right.
And I would hate to stifle this sense of participation that is the objective of the neighborhood councils. So, for example, let me take a step back. Building safety has a process. You have a permit, you go through it, you have cycles, you know when it comes in, when it goes out, who's going to see a specific function and get a result. Is that something we could look towards?
Yeah, it is difficult for us to say how many grievances ultimately be coming through this process, only because currently, it ranges between 30 to 50 grievances, and that's not including the complaints that come separately to the department that we need to resolve, which we get on easily a weekly basis. So if we were to collapse that into a system that then would have go into that grievance panel system, it's hard to say. It could resolve and neighborhood councils could resolve the issue at their level, and it wouldn't have to go up any higher. But we wouldn't know. Again, there would be a learning process for us if we were to implement something like this.
I think the main difference between the commissioner's recommendation, as Ms. Liu pointed out, is it's the council's choice as to whether you would like to be involved in the grievance resolution process or not. If you want it contained within the system and have the jury of peers, the peer grievance panel, if they're serving in that process, I think it would make sense to empower them with a certain amount of not formal authority, but the power to make recommendations to the department to implement remedies. And then for that person, for those volunteers who are spending that time to feel like the commission could override it, I don't know how much value what kind of signal that would send. But then I think the most fundamental issue, and there's also a cost implication, right? So if the commission can serve as the appellate body, we would have to staff that process. And then in turn, if that grievant were to appeal to the city council, we would also have to staff that process. So that would add to the costs of the grievance system.
So, in referring to this chart, you have a 45 to 60 day time frame once it goes through this first phase. Yeah, we heard years. So that tells me that there's a backlog of sorts, and or we don't have enough people involved to make it flow.
Ms. Talala, I honestly don't recall which grievance she's speaking of that took 4 years. I do know that she would call and let the department know many of her problems with the neighborhood councils, and we ultimately said you need to go through a grievance process. And when she did go through the grievance process, the neighborhood council did form their committee and resolve the grievance, and it did took approximately 6 months. and that's when I checked back with a neighborhood council, they did provide me evidence of their conclusion. I'm not sure. I mean, clearly it seems it may not have been to Ms. Talala's liking, but because we don't have a secondary,
Ms. Talala, it's out of order, I'm sorry.
because we don't have a secondary process for review, then it pretty much is resolved at the neighborhood council level.
Okay. So that's why I want to get a sense of volume, because I think it helps us to make informed decisions as to what our role should be or could be to enhance it, as opposed to creating another loop, another layer of work that in the end doesn't get to the end result. So that's my concern.
And the real challenge, I mean, facing all of us in the city is where's the money going to come from? Because we can't currently implement the proposed model without additional staff. I think it's realistic that we could accomplish this with one additional staff person, but it will require additional resources.
Gotcha.
And it would be true that it would require some additional resources regardless of what model were to be adopted. Right? Whether there's a referral process that includes bonk, whether there's regional grievance panels that are administered, that process is administered by DEN, there's going to be some budgetary impact of a change in the grievance process, no matter what model we choose, right?
Yeah, that's fair to say.
So, that being said, I think that I'd like to recommend your report to council with the request that council refer the matter to Budget and Finance for further consideration about the possible budgetary impacts of the various models. And I'd specifically like the department to provide specific comment on the bonk, an implementation of the bonk resolution and what the policy implications are there and what considerations council should take into account with regard to that resolution.
Mr. Chair, may I add? Only because you haven't done it yet, it's hard to say what that additional resource will do. But if there is a guesstimation of what is the added benefit for that incremental increase, whether it's staff hours or personnel, some way to quantify it, because there's so much here, and the volume is so great, and the bottleneck is so intense. And so what is whatever unit you want to define that speaks to added performance or added results, I will leave that to you to frame it in the best way possible so that we understand the opportunity cost for not doing this. Because now we're talking about, do we take away from one area of the city, say police or fire or rec and park? I mean, it's got to come from somewhere. So when we're balancing this out, what does that incremental increase do? And I think that would give us a better sense of how we weigh our options. But if it's to just generically enhance or make quicker, faster, well, what does that mean? What does that do? How does that effectuate the quality of life that we're trying to seek with the involvement of the neighborhood councils? So just something that I think that would help us make a decision.
Very good. Okay. Is that clear enough?
Mr. Chair, referrals, we can request a referral directly from the council president to another committee. As far as that part goes,
If we don't need to stop at council and we can just refer.
I mean, basically
directly
just
upon
make the request
that'd
as
be
far
great.
as, that piece goes. As far as the other, it sounds like a report back, so do we send it to council on that piece or hold it in committee or go either way?
Can we get the report referred to Budget and Finance with the additional requests that Mr. Reyes has made and that I just suggested?
Well, yeah, once they come back with it, it'll be referred, both places, because there's going to be, budgetary impacts to proposed plans, so it automatically would kick over anyway.
Right.
So we can, do that, if you, in that manner, if you wish.
hate to let go of it, but yeah, okay, let's go ahead and do it.
Because it'll get shot to both back here and Budget and Finance, and it would anyway, even if they independently propose that.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, that's okay, Mr. Reyes, that'll be the action of this committee, and that brings us to item number 3.
Item number 3 is a Dunn report in response to a motion Krikorian-Koretz relative to a neighborhood council regional governance system.
In regards to the regional governance system, this is something that initially came out of the Valley Alliance of Neighborhood Councils. When they were responding to diminishing city resources, they proposed a regional governance system that would have neighborhood councils helping other neighborhood councils. Their initial proposal, however, had some costs associated with it in regards to staffing, which ended up not being tenable. When the department went out to the neighborhood councils for feedback on this issue, generally in the Valley, East, and Harbor areas, they were open to a type of regional administration system rather than a governance system, whereby the neighborhood councils in one region could share resources, such as basic administrative work or taking minutes, posting, agendas, grievances, elections, training, outreach. The other areas of the city were not so open to such a regional system. They felt that it was unnecessary, that they were already working together informally. And so when we took this to a work group, the work group actually wanted to focus more on grievances and didn't particularly develop the governance system, like a proposal for a governance system. As a result, we don't have a system to put out there for the committee to really review at this moment. The only thing that in connection to this that would be pretty imminent would be elections, because if the department were to execute elections this next fiscal year, we would likely sit it on some type of regional administrative platform, such as the ones that were proposed in this report. In the meantime, the department was thinking of perhaps piloting a regional administrative program maybe in the East or the South LA, where they do need a little more support for the neighborhood councils there. However, we have not, because of the time issue in terms of preparing these reports, been able to put together something substantive for your consideration.
I would just also add that during the work groups and the regional alliances, I think the most consistent concern I heard was, is this another way for the city to add more bureaucracy to an already volunteer-intensive system? And I clarified many, many times that that was not what I heard coming from the chair of this committee, that it was really designed to address two purposes. How do you strengthen a system that is designed around promoting participation and self-governance? And secondly, how do we address the fact that the department is simply unable to staff the needs of 95 neighborhood councils throughout the city? And it is my concern that whatever remedy we come up with addresses the fact that there are a lot of neighborhood councils that are that we are not able to help. Simply, we don't have the bodies. So the basic idea that I think would be of benefit is to think about the neighborhood council system being more of a regional system, where anywhere from 6 to 12 neighborhood councils are meeting on some frequent basis, mainly around the administrative stuff. So an example around the elections is there were a group of neighborhood councils in the Valley, maybe 6 of them, that got together. They pooled their money together. They met on a regular basis, and they conducted a pretty effective outreach campaign for 6 neighborhood councils in that region. And that's, I think, more of the direction that I believe the chair of this committee wanted to go in, is how do you address the systemic barriers to improving the system given the fiscal constraints that we have. So I had to repeat this message several times, that this is not an effort to add another layer of bureaucracy, but really to add value in ways that are really focused on what both the city needs as well as the neighborhood councils.
Exactly. In fact, the intention is to further empower the neighborhood council movement by devolving more responsibility and more authority from the centralized department to the councils themselves. And to perform the kinds of services that, with budget constraints and personnel constraints, the department is not able to provide. That is the overall, theme of this. But it's clear to me that I think we haven't gotten far enough along in really developing that theme and how it, should be manifested to really advance a specific policy proposal here. But you did mention the possible regional approach on elections, and if I'm not mistaken, you're still going to be reporting back to us on your implementation plan for elections, right? So can we, I'd like to request then that be included within that report, your proposal for how to utilize a regional approach to elections in your administration of this year's elections. And I think that should, at minimum, be a step that we take today. Mr. Reyes, do you have questions on this?
No, you hit all the points. It's really about capacity, and if we were to have an election in 2012, how could we administer it, given the staff issues we have, and do we actually have an infrastructure to perform with? So I'm rather anxious to see how we respond to those questions.
It's not exactly part of this agenda item, but it's related to this agenda item. What is the timeline for when we'll be getting that implementation plan back on elections?
I will have a draft of it ready this week.
Oh, great.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so let's go to cards on this item then. We'll start with Ida Talala, followed by Ivan Spiegel.
My name is Ida Talala, and I do apologize for that outburst, but the frustration of hearing Dunn lie again and again over a hearing that has never, ever occurred. The grievance hearing included 2 grievances, one filed by Nora Sanchez and Augustine Cibada about the use of Spanish in the
Ma'am, if I may, I
No.
don't want to do it back and forth
No.
on a specific grievance.
I'm-
We're right now on item 3, which deals with regionalization.
Yes.
And then if you'd like to speak separately with them or with committee or
No.
during public comment, we can
I
revisit the
just
decision.
wanted to apologize.
No, not at all. It's
Um,
fine.
And I certainly will follow this up.
Thank you.
We have heard when Dunn had 59 staff, it did not have time to look into neighborhood councils, and at that time, I believe there were only 84. We've also heard that Dunn has not had any time. The entire city is hurting. There are many departments are doubling up. You have your subcontractors doubling up and working very hard. And they are coming up with creative solutions about this. Essentially, Dunn has neglected neighborhood councils and getting input from stakeholders. There is no information anywhere to be found, really, on what even your neighborhood council, what region it belongs to. They are holding meetings that never trickle down. You don't know where these meetings are held. Who on your neighborhood council is attending it? What the agenda was? There is no information. There is a possible site that I, when my computer was running, went to. You had to log in. You had to declare who you were. Most people don't want to do that. You need a better system.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ivan Spiegel, followed by Tony Wilkinson.
So this is the one motion I don't like. It came to my council and it was unanimously voted down. It came to the West Side Regional Alliance of Councils. It was unanimously voted down. There are areas of the city that can't even get it together to form a regional alliance. So this is going to be a big push. Where this is going to come from, we don't know. There's going to have to be a done staffer or a staff person at each of these regional governance things because somebody has to deal with all that paperwork. You know, councils aren't going to do it on their own. The big thing for me is we're at a point now, we're 10, 11 years into this system, where we're finally talking to each other. We're cooperating with each other. We're starting to build citywide movements so that we can take positions on citywide issues like the budget advocates are doing. This is going to splinter us. It's going to put each of us in our own little area with our own rules, with our own procedures. So you're going to have 7 mini neighborhood council areas. I don't know how you're going to pull that together once you do that. Right now it's informal. A lot of us are working that way. It's working out fine, and I think we should leave that.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Tony Wilkinson, followed by Glenn Bailey, if you're okay. Mr. Bailey, can you? Yeah.
Well, this hornet's nest was originally stirred up, I guess, by the Valley Alliance. But one of the things I can say for sure is that I actually do agree with the perception of people like Ivan who don't necessarily want structure. There's partially about a hesitancy to want to go to a borough system. You know, there's some feeling, Raphael Schoenstein likes the boroughs and so on, that this could become a governing body. And I think that I'd really like to go back to what Councilmember Reyes was asking in an earlier question about capacity. What we've got now is we don't, instead of a solution seeking a problem, what we've got is a problem that needs a solution. And the logical problem of Dunn not having the staff and challenges like how do we pull off elections in 2012 without the clerk coming to do it? This is what local, and I hate to say regional because it doesn't mean there are boundaries around it and it's an organization, but councils who gather together close to the need, being able to help each other in ways that Dunn staff is unavailable to do. And I think they would, the Valley Alliance has now got what we call a resource board, the Valley Alliance Resource Board, and that's exactly what it is. It's us helping each other to get things done. And I think that that's a good model, and let it grow as it shows capacity. And some may grow stronger than others, some may be able to take on more roles than others. But at least everyone will be able to be helping each other locally because that's the only way we're going to survive, given the reality that Dunn is not going to have enough staff. So I think that this is a way to continue. As Ivan said, let us keep on doing what we're doing. Yes, but, you know, we already work together locally. Let's just make it a little bit more formal, and we'll get more work done.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Glenn Bailey, followed by Doug Everard.
Glenn Bailey again. So the San Fernando Valley has 1.4 million of the city's population, nearly 40%. It has 34 of its 95 neighborhood councils. And the Valley Alliance of Neighborhood Councils has been active for 9 years as of this coming March. You're invited to our 9th annual mixer at CBS Studios. And so are you. So, you know, and one of the benefits of that monthly get-together is sharing knowledge and information of the neighborhood councils, some of whom may be specialized and focused on various issues, some of which affect multiple neighborhood councils. Some of them are citywide issues. Some of them are, I guess you'd call them regional, like, for example, the LA River. As it comes through the San Fernando Valley, it hits neighborhood council after neighborhood council, and there's issues. It doesn't affect all of the neighborhood councils in the valley. There are other issues like the sidewalk repair transfer of authority. That affects everyone in the city. But it allows us that opportunity to get updated on issues without necessarily everyone having to reinvent the wheel. It allows department heads, and frankly, Mr. Kim has been at many of the meetings. His Gracie and other staff have been at the meetings. Rather than going to 95 different neighborhood councils, come to alliances. And so my pitch is strengthen them, use them, and also identify those areas of the city we don't have robust alliances. Use the Dunn staff to encourage, it's voluntary, but encourage to have strong alliances because it makes the work easier for all of us. The city staff, the department heads who want to spread a message, it's impossible in 95 monthly meetings. But you could go to maybe 6 or 7 alliances that then reach out to all of the neighborhood councils theoretically. And that would be the goal that I would strongly recommend that we push. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, on one of those comments, perhaps the ratepayer advocate can also have a greater arena to engage as opposed to going to the 95. So that'd be good.
Batting cleanup is Commissioner Everhart. Going to pass?
You're very eloquent. I agree with all.
All right. Okay. So I think given where we are on developing this, and given the fact that there will be an election report coming very shortly that will incorporate some of the regional concepts, I think it's my recommendation that it do so, and I think you already had planned to incorporate that into it. And given the fact that there will be a done budget proposal being submitted to the mayor to be a part of the mayor's proposed budget, which I assume will include also some regionalization options as part of your budget strategy. Right. What I'd like to do is, at this point, note and file this report in its current form. But I would like to revisit these issues with you through the budget process, through the election proposal, and also continue to work with you in how we can strengthen the utilization of the alliances that a number of the speakers have talked about, and particularly for developing alliances where we don't currently have them. I think that's a really critical point in making the system as a whole work. So, Mr. Reyes, if you're in agreement, I think we'll just go ahead and note and file this, and we'll proceed with the overall issue through these other avenues for now.
Very good.
All right, thank you. So that brings us to item number 4.
Item number 4 is a Dunn report in response to a motion Krikorian-Smith relative to Neighborhood Council System Funding Program and related matters.
Thank you. The department was directed to report back on the Neighborhood Council funding system and the needed improvements that are there. There are specifically 4 items that we were directed to report back on. One was clarifying the encumbrance policy, given that council had taken action to eliminate the rollover ability of neighborhood councils to roll over funds from one fiscal year to another. We were directed to explore alternative funding models, including a grant option. Thirdly, develop a mechanism by which neighborhood councils may request to roll over funds from year to year on a project-by-project basis. And then lastly, the purchase of equipment by neighborhood councils for city departments. We followed a similar process in terms of the work groups and meeting with the regional alliances and the general. On the encumbrance matter, we have been working with the neighborhood councils and the city controller's office to really broaden or clarify the ability of neighborhood councils to encumber funds, especially since the rollover policy and option has been eliminated. So the city policy allowing city departments to encumber funds, that process have mainly three components. One would be neighborhood councils having a maximum dollar amount. They would have to also include a payee and a board action. And we would have the ability to encumber funds for neighborhood councils. I think it'll be important, particularly if the city council were to enable elections to happen, that neighborhood councils would be responsible for paying for the outreach expenses as recommended in our report. So we will plan to do that as part of our year-end closing process. There was also the direction to standardize financial templates, forms, and reporting, and to streamline approvals and management of the program. Really what is critical here is the ability of the department to develop an electronic platform for the funding program. The fact that we have a manual paper-based system is literally costing the city a lot more time than is necessary. So I recently engaged a consultant from ITA to work with us to conduct a system design and analysis, and we will be coming back as part of this report back once the consultant concludes their work with a recommendation for the department to either go out to RFP to select a vendor or to develop some in-house solutions to that. But I can't emphasize enough the need for the department to really develop an electronic platform, and I would ask the council's support to develop that. I think that a lot of the issues that I hear, that you hear about the funding program and losing demand warrants and not having bills paid on time will be resolved by developing this electronic platform. The second item had to do with the option of developing.
Actually, before you move to that
Sure.
point, just to stay on the electronic platform for a minute, you talked about some of the capabilities of it. Would that also, I'm not the technical guy around here, as my staff will attest, but would that kind of a system allow public transparency as well,
Yes.
so that a particular neighborhood council's warrants, how it's expended its money and so forth, would be available to anybody who wanted to have access to that?
Absolutely. It would be, we currently post all of the financial transactions on our website, so all stakeholders in the general public can see all of the checks that have been approved as well as the purchase card transactions. But this system would definitely make the data much more user-friendly so that the general public wouldn't have to navigate through several layers of websites to get to that information. So that is very much the idea, that particularly when you look at the fact that we're not able to monitor what neighborhood councils spend money on, so the fact that we can make that data as transparent and accessible as possible so that stakeholders can watch where their taxpayer dollars are going is really going to, I think, increase the transparency of public funds and the use of public funds.
And it would be such so that there should be no future ambiguity or lack of clarity about what funds might be available for a particular neighborhood council as rollover funds or otherwise, so that everybody
That's right.
knows, the department knows, the neighborhood council knows, the public knows, these are the funds that have been expended, these are still available, that will get rid of any of the past concerns we've had about, there being disagreements over how much might still be on the books.
Right, and that was really one of the main challenges, especially when the council passed the elimination of the rollover policy, is we had a manual system of reconciling the balances, and which didn't account for all of the demand warrants that were in process. So I can't describe to you the number of headaches that I encounter on a daily basis having to deal with this funding program, but the fact that this system will have the ability to show in real time a financial statement, which shows what was approved as the board-approved budget, what were the actual expenses that were paid, and what is what they call accounts payable, and meaning what are the payments that are due. That ideally it would have been ideal to have that system in place by the end of this fiscal year. It's pretty ambitious, given the way that the RFP process takes 6 to 12 months. But I will continue to push very hard to make this electronic platform a reality, because it really will go miles in terms of instilling more confidence in the funding program.
Thank you.
Councilman, right. And there are fundamental assumptions being made when we do anticipate these accounts to be shown on the record for transparency's sake. And the main assumption is that those who are handling the money are actually reporting it. And so that element of what is real and what isn't still needs to be addressed, given the accountability issue, correct? So I don't want to make it sound like because now we have this, we're going to know everything. We still need that fundamental step because of the, I've engaged different conversations, very sensitive as to how money is handled and who reports it and how it gets distributed and for whom. And these are all subjective accountability issues that we have yet to really address in a manner that is as thorough as we could be, given the volume of transactions occurring out there. Would that be accurate?
Yes, there are cases where treasurers are not reporting to the board what is being spent, and we have a policy of requiring that all boards are monitoring and approving all of their expenditures, but we don't have the ability to monitor that.
Right.
So I think that is what I'm hoping that this electronic platform will be able to show. If you look at a transaction, you could actually make a couple of clicks and see the board whether the board actually made a board action, a board motion to make that transaction an approval.
I just thought it was important to make that issue.
Right.
I mean, that's a big assumption. So
it is.
On the last point, does this offer, knowing that we have to find ways to grow the city, if you will, and our ability to pay for our function, does this new system allow for the possibility of a discussion that speaks to how money can come in to benefit the department, and creating an avenue or a mechanism that allows for transparency, so that way it's not being asserted that so-and-so donated this much or this entity donated X dollars for this department? Does it open up the question towards that level of discussion, if it's going to be as transparent as it seems to be?
Are you talking about the department's budget? And
right.
How we, that's not a part of this funding motion. It was really more addressed to the...
No, I understand that, but
right.
I'm just, again, we're at this moment in time, and we keep talking about how we don't have enough resources, not enough revenue to support positions to continue operating. But now that you have this new system, does that open the door for that kind of discussion, where we can now look at the transparency of how we can or will receive money in the future?
Yes, absolutely.
So it opens the door for that potential.
Yes, it does.
Okay.
The other part of this motion also, well, another part of the motion before you arrived, Councilman, was the mandatory training. And that's the other part of this puzzle, is the humans involved in managing public funds. There's a wide level of skill sets. You know, many people have never handled public funds before. So if we require that all board members go through some fundamental training about what public funds, how public funds are to be managed, and the requirements that the city has, I think that will also go a long way to make sure that folks are holding each other accountable.
Right, and not to belabor the point, but if you have entities that benefit from a tax write-off or participating in a philanthropic gesture and or a gesture of fundraising that supports a public good, and there's a tax benefit to that, does that open up a revenue stream that could enhance the capacity of done, as long as those who are participating are viewed by all in a very transparent fashion, so that accountability can be asserted. And we have capacity building within the department to support those who are volunteering their time. I mean, I'm just trying to open up that door to see where we can take that if we have this level of technology that can enhance transparency.
I would love to be able to do fundraising for the neighborhood council system. I come from the nonprofit world and I've raised millions of dollars, but we don't currently have the staff capacity or the budget to do that. But I think these kind of structural reforms and developing an electronic platform for all our work. We're also looking at an electronic case management system, so we could actually track all the calls that we get and then until they're resolved, and then make that also work and streamline our work. And I think that we will actually, hopefully, free up some staff time just by the fact that we're developing an electronic platform for the way we do our work.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So to conclude with this portion of the report back, the grant-based funding option was universally disliked. A lot of the feedback was that it would be cumbersome for the neighborhood councils to develop any kind of grant-based way of distributing the public funds. And Councilman, for your information, the idea is rather than as an alternative to providing each neighborhood council with an allocation of funding, is there some way to look at developing like a grant-based program whereby people can apply for funds and therefore the funds are being used in ways that are more consistent and transparent.
But it was not instead of. It was in addition to their funding program allocation. There would some portion of that, or some portion of whatever the rollover recapture was, would be devoted to this grant funding mechanism.
Right. But when I suggested that one option that we could recommend to the council is that unspent funds left from neighborhood councils at the end of the year be made available and kept within the system, and those funds being available to made available on a grant basis. There was a lot of support for that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I had thought we were going to do all along. So glad to hear it.
Okay.
But I'm touching on a sensitive issue. There's this dynamic where we find ourselves within a tale of two cities. We have certain conditions in certain neighborhoods that have the ability to engage the infrastructure, and others that don't have as much ability for whatever reason. Demographics, income, language barriers, etc., poverty. I'm hoping that as we move forward in that concept, that we understand that those differing challenges can be addressed and offset so that there is equal access, or as much access to grants and resources. I think there's more, I've just seen it, more hand-holding because of the notion of familiarity with how one engages the process from certain parts of the city. That's rather unfortunate, but at the same time, I think it's our role, since they are taxpayers, to help facilitate that connectivity. And on the sheer face of it, just to do the basics, we're having a tough time because of the lack of staff and overwhelming demand, let alone take that extra step to cultivate and engender that level of confidence in dealing with language barriers and poverty and social, how can I put this, challenges. So is that in your radar and in your thought process?
It's always on my radar. The fact that
I know it is, but I needed to ask.
the fact that Bel Air, Beverly Crest gets the same funding allocation as Watts, and I actually went in one night to both board meetings, and the extraordinary challenges that low-income communities face. So one recommendation that I would make in terms of this notion of maintaining unspent funds within the system would be to prioritize the use of those funds exactly based on the notion of balancing the diverse socioeconomic factors across the city. So translation. There are some neighborhood councils that spend $20,000 on translation because they have to have a translator there every day. And there are some areas of the city that they don't need a translator. Is that equitable? I don't think so. So that would be one way that I would recommend approaching the fact that there is no equity in the way the funding system was structured.
Thank you.
And by the way, it's a sensitive subject, but on that issue of equity, neighborhood councils throughout the city are of widely varying size geographically, widely varying population, and of course widely varying socioeconomic need, and yet everyone gets the exact same funding program. I have thought about how to make that more equitable, and I don't have a solution for it, but it's a fundamental problem, I think,
Yes.
that we continue to have to think about as a community.
Absolutely. So the third item has to do with allowing neighborhood councils to roll over funds for specific projects, and I think this addressed the council interest in where neighborhood councils are partnering with some council offices for infrastructure improvements, like median improvements and construction projects that are multi-year. There was support for that with the neighborhood councils. I think this would be a workload issue for the department, but some of the there is a capital improvement project procedure in place in the city, and I think it would be just a matter of adopting that current procedure in the city and make it fit the neighborhood councils. So for those neighborhood councils who do set aside funds for physical infrastructure type projects, would be something that we would come back to you at a future time to report back on exactly what the mechanism for that would be. We probably won't be able to do that for this fiscal year, given that we're approaching year-end closing, and all of our staff time is being ready to address the flood of demand warrants that we expect to be getting, so that neighborhood councils are spending as much of their funds as possible. But that's the direction that we plan on heading for that item. The last item had to do with equipment purchases. Some neighborhood councils spend funds for supporting the kind of discretionary needs that various departments have. The more common ones tend to be police, fire, Parks and Rec. Some neighborhood councils fund their local schools in buying books and computers. And I think the intent of this motion was really to clarify the direction or a policy that would help direct the use of those funds in ways that have more integrity. Currently, as long as they're following the procedure that we set up for purchasing equipment, there's some issues where if a neighborhood council buys equipment and then donates it to a city department, makes it more complicated for us in terms of tracking that equipment. What we would have to say is it's much easier to transfer funds from one department to another and then have that department be responsible for buying and maintaining the equipment. So that would be one possible way that we could use to make sure that the buying of the equipment is tracked more and in a more accountable way. There are some feelings that neighbor councils purchasing equipment and those kinds of things for city departments is doing an end around in the city approval budget process, so that it doesn't really appear in the city overall budget approval, and that was surfaced sometimes as a concern, more from kind of members of the city family that I hear. But neighborhood councils generally do like the ability to help their local fire station or their local police station in addressing needs that they wouldn't otherwise be able to meet given the city approval, budget approval process.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Reyes, anything else on this, or should we hear from the public?
Just one question I didn't want to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. The advisory role of neighborhood councils, and the nexus to expenditures, is there any weight put on that in terms of how resources are used or dollars being used by the advisory councils, neighborhood councils that are advisory? It's in terms of where's the range of the nexus of that function, because that's what the purpose of these organizations are, is to advise and support. And so is there a nexus issue at all, or are we just kind of open it up and everyone decides how to spend the money the way they want?
Well, if I understand your question correctly, how do the use of public funds relate to the charter mandated purpose of neighborhood councils?
Right.
And I would say that from the city side, in terms of policies, that there could be value in clarifying that. One of the recent controller audits found that as a deficiency from the city side, that there isn't enough direction being given to neighborhood councils about how their funds are used. I do see some value in providing some clarity in terms of making sure that public funds are, to the greatest extent possible, being used to fulfill the neighborhood council's charter purpose.
Yeah, I don't want to open up a can of worms, but I just know that the turbulence out there gets a little stronger around campaign time. And levels of discretion become much more, I mean, the needle kind of goes back and forth in a very frantic manner, and you scratch your head and say, well, how did that happen? Mm-hmm. And then there's nothing really to guide anybody with. So that's why I raised it, because...
Well, we clarified before every election cycle, we clarified to the neighborhood councils that public funds are, there are certain allowable uses for public funds, particularly around political campaigns, and neighborhood councils are not allowed to use public funds to take positions or endorse candidates. It's mainly used for educational purposes. There are some neighborhood councils that don't follow those policies, and if I'm aware of them, then we bring them to task, because that is a violation of law.
Thank you, sir.
Does the momentum towards, if that's the right word, does the adoption of standardized budget templates help to focus attention on what the limited range of appropriate uses of neighborhood council budgets is for?
I would say to a limited extent. The four categories that we have in our standardized budget template are administrative costs, administrative and operations. The second is for community beautification. The third is for outreach. And the fourth is for grants to nonprofit organizations and schools.
That's pretty limited guidance.
Yeah. Yes. So there's wide discretion. There's still wide discretion.
Okay.
And the budget template doesn't provide that kind of direction.
Okay. Thank you. All right, let's hear from first Mr. Wilkinson and then Mr. Bailey.
I've got to go quick because this is filled with stuff. Thank you for bringing that up, Councilmember Reyes, because I think really one of the things that we do need to look at is an ability to bring in extra money. I know when we did a local project, we were able to get a fiscal agent. It happened to be the grid contractor in our area, nonprofit, to be able to handle donations because we can't touch them. So it would be great to have Dunn be able to do something like that. But the challenge is, of course, the city council is not going to, and I'll speak frankly, give a department a fiscal agency role when it hasn't done a very good job, and because of a manual system, handling the paperwork it has now. And I would say I am very hesitant. I mean, we have to help each other out here. But it's still, I'm very hesitant what I just heard about the proposed accounting system, because I worry when the consultant comes from the ITA. I've seen the limits of the current city a new financial management system in its inflexibility in dealing with some of the neighborhood council issues. I think maybe some of these things need to be, before we get to an RFP and before we design some system based on the department's needs. I think there needs to be neighborhood council and community input, including accountants and people who professionally use these systems all day long, about what the chart of account should look like, what the disclosure should be. I think one of the things that Dunn needs to really get credit for is that even the problems that raised all the financial issues that we had a couple of years ago, they were determined because Dunn posted the transactions on the website and stakeholders caught them. So let's give ourselves credit where things are going well. We desperately need this, but I don't think we ought to run to an RFP before we look very carefully at what we're building. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Glenn Bailey, followed by Ida Talala.
Glenn Bailey, good afternoon again. So yes, this topic could constitute an entire meeting afternoon just in and of itself. 2 years ago, the city controller came out with an audit of neighborhood councils. I think, although it's an audit, and I know there's an audit committee of the council, a lot of the issues that were brought up in that audit, some of them are still unresolved, and I think it dovetails with the work of this committee, especially in the financial area. I won't go into the details of those, but I have a report that the city controller that's dated January 12th that shows the status of some of those items. With regards to the rollover money, I understand that that's only done, I guess, by council members and the mayor, but please consider the uniqueness of neighborhood councils and the fact that there are 1,800 volunteers, not just board members, there's other people who are stakeholders that are involved as well. And that maybe, I know the city needs money, but maybe you could allow a one-year rollover so that some of these projects, like the capital projects, could be funded, especially since I hear from I hear that the funding, the annual funding, will be cut to $35,000 for next fiscal year. So it's going to make it more difficult to get the monies for some of these community improvement projects that some of the neighborhood councils are really focused on. Also, in terms of the private fundraising abilities, absolutely second that. That's been something that's sorely needed. We can, a lot of the local stores like Walmart's, they give $1,000, $2,000 for local projects. If neighborhood councils could be one of the partners, and I think that would multiply the money. CD12 Councilman Englander said that if 2 or more neighborhood councils work together on a project, he'll match the money. I don't know if that offer still stands, but that was a inducement for neighborhood councils to work together and for community benefit. So time's up. Thanks.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ida Talala, followed by Commissioner Eberhardt.
Thank you. I've been very interested in neighborhood councils for a long time, 2005 onwards, and voted. And I speak from a perspective of being very active in the community, even if it's a selective way of dealing with neighborhood, the trash that impacts the environment. I think that this is a very important issue, and the electronic platform that is being talked about, I think might be a way to look at how to better convey the information as to how that money is being spent and allocated. This process of monies is obscure to the general stakeholder. Unless you go to the meeting, you don't have no idea what it's listed under vendor. You don't know what the event is or the date of the event. There is no paperwork to track back who the contact person was or anything, except with the greatest of difficulty and an impossibility of getting done to give you any of that paperwork. The budget committees have not met so infrequently at the neighborhood council level that it's a joke. There is stuff taken to done that hasn't been vetted by the treasurer. I think all of this needs to cease. You need to put a date, an event with the vendor's name as a start so that we in the community can track it. Also, a lot of these payments come at different times but belong to the same event. There's no way you can link it up. You need transparency because at the present time, it is a sore, what is it? It's nothing but a sore.
Thank you. Next speaker is Commissioner Eberhardt, followed by Ivan Spiegel.
When I joined the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners about 3 months ago, I didn't know there was going to be a big sign on my back that said, "Tell me your complaint about funding." That is far and away the number one thing I have heard about from neighborhood councils, even after a decade. There are two parts to this situation. One is the technical, the simple thing of, we want to spend money on this, how do we get this bill paid, whether it's electronically or not. But again, I'm going to come back and echo Councilmember Reyes there. The people who are involved in the neighborhood council system range from those who do everything electronically, who are transferring money in their accounts on their cell phones, and who never use paper, to those in neighborhoods where cash is the only thing they use. They don't even have bank accounts, so that's not something they're used to dealing with. So the electronic thing is good, but again, remember, there is such a huge range of folks within the system that we've got to be able to teach them if they need to be taught how to use these tools. The second thing is in terms of dealing with what's appropriate. Back when funding first started, the idea was we're going to give this money to neighborhood councils to run their councils, to hire secretaries, somebody to do the minutes, to buy some microphones for the meetings, etc. The idea of funding anything within a city department was not part of that. The idea of giving money away to well-deserving groups was not part of that. With regard to one size fits all, before funding occurred, I had proposed that at the time the fund had $4 million a year in it, and I said 4 million people, let's go $1 a head. So if your neighborhood council has 80,000 people, you get $80,000. If it has 20,000 people, you get $20,000. So I think these are some fundamental questions we really need to address alongside the technical stuff. And I'd like, if it's a working group or whatever it is, I'd like something set up to really begin to tackle these fundamental questions. Thanks.
Thank you. And we've done an awful lot of that kind of discussion and outreach, but still there's a lot more that still needs to be resolved, to be sure.
Hello again.
Mr. Spiegel.
So I'm generally in favor of this. I think any time we can try to pull the finances together is certainly applaudable. I think Dunn staff is going to have to deal with a lot of this. They are probably going to need additional staff to implement some of these things. They're not just going to happen. I think we have to be careful about fundraising. I know it's a great idea, and you two gentlemen, I'm sure know, because you spend your lives fundraising when you're not sitting here. See, okay. There have to be some real strict guidelines in place before you allow neighborhood councils to go out and start raising some money. All right. There's no campaign reporting that they have to do. We had people raising money for their campaigns this last election. Didn't have to report it. We have no idea where the money came from. I'm really afraid of big corporations maybe coming in. All right, I'll give you $20,000 to do this thing in the park. Later this year we're going to be coming up for a. All right, how do you prevent that from happening? On your level, there are guidelines in place to protect the public from that happening. We don't have that. So before you allow that to come in, you're going to have to come up with some kind of guidelines to protect us, because people will do it. If they can raise money, they'll do it.
Great. Thank you. All right. Anything else from the department on this? Okay. So a lot of work's been done on the funding program. A lot of loose ends still to be worked on further. I'm going to suggest that we recommend this report to council to note and file on council. I think there's still much to be done that, again, through your budget process and the Neighborhood Council funding program budget process as it's upcoming, a lot of these details will have to be still continue to be worked out in that role. So I would just, I guess, suggest that we will continue this dialogue in the Budget and Finance Committee. And I think that, to Commissioner Eberhard's point, having the alliances and the Neighborhood Council community continue to try to work on how to define appropriate expenditures of this public funding, how to create more efficiencies, how to work with you to create a greater degree of accountability. That just has to be a continuing dialogue that moves forward with the stakeholders. So that will be, Mr. Reyes, it will just, if you agree, that will be the recommendation. That will be the action of this committee.
Mr. Chair, also, on item 1,
Yes.
we heard it when Mr. Reyes was in the room. Do you wish to
I would like to
concur with?
reopen that, and if you could restate whatever it was that I said then. If you can recall, I'll try to reconfigure it if you
All right. This item will be taken to council with a number of recommendations that were made. Let's go back on the tape, but basically requesting Dunn to make a series of report backs on fundamental policy changes with the training program, to include taking into account things like ethics, Brown Act, funding methods, procedures. Also, attention being given to making training accessible to all groups, different languages, things of that nature.
So in essence, it was to have Dunn report back with a plan that would achieve mandated training on those areas that could impact liability to the city, the statutorily mandated training areas, ethics, sexual harassment, and the funding program. That an enforcement mechanism be a part of that, so that if a board member does not comply, there is some enforcement mechanism, and that there be an implementation plan that includes ease of compliance for the broad range of neighborhood council stakeholders who may not have access to computers, may have language limitations, disabilities, and so forth. And then also instructing the department to continue to develop and a plan for a broader basic board orientation that would be accessible to all neighborhood council members as well, that would not be part of the mandatory training, but still would be there for the enhancement of the capabilities of neighborhood council board members.
And I'll second that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Then that brings us to general public comment.
Councilman, while
Yes.
the public comment come up, before the committee adjourns and I lose the opportunity to work with you further through this committee, I just wanted to state for the record how much I thoroughly enjoyed and was impressed by your leadership. As you stated, the neighborhood council system is vast and complex and very hard to understand, but you were up to the task, and the way that you engaged neighborhood councils throughout the city was impressive, and I wanted to thank you and acknowledge you for your leadership.
Kind of you to say, and I guess I was going to wait on this, but let me take the moment then also to first
he
of all
beat me to the
return
punch.
return the compliment. For 2 years, it's been a real privilege for me to be able to serve as chair of this committee in both of its permutations, and working with you, Mr. Kim and Ms. Liu, and the entire Dunn staff has really been a privilege. I know that you're very passionate about the cause of neighborhood empowerment. You've been doing great work under extraordinarily difficult times, as all of our city departments are right now. And it has been a genuine pleasure helping to make a difference for neighborhood empowerment with all of you. And I also, this committee is a team effort. Everything we do here is a team effort. So I also want to recognize the great work of the CLA staff, Daryl Powell, Andrea Galvin, Paul Smith, the CAO's staff, Terry Sauer, Delilah Puche, city clerk staff, Adam Lidd, of course our clerk June Lagmay and Holly Walcott, great work that they did in trying to get through the challenges of figuring out how to run elections and then transfer election authority, and it was a heavy lift, and they did a great job as partners in that effort. Of course, Bonk, Commissioner Epperhart's here, but I also want to recognize all of the Bonk commissioners for their service to the city and their partnership with this committee, and from the mayor, all the mayor's office representatives that have participated here, especially Larry Frank, and my colleagues, President Garcetti and President Wesson, for giving me this opportunity, and Mr. Reyes, Dennis Zine, and Janice Hahn, who've served so capably on this committee, and my extraordinary staff, who not only do such a great job in the policy development in this committee, but who, like you, Mr. Kim, and like so many others here, have to actually be out there on the firing line with 95 neighborhood councils and their board members and their stakeholders. And I especially want to recognize Irina Brenosian, who has really been the guiding light of this committee since I've been on it. And lastly, and most important, I want to thank all of you from the members of the public who are here every single time we meet to provide comment, to provide input. If there's ever a committee that should embrace the engagement of the public, it's the committee that oversees our great mission of neighborhood empowerment that's embodied in the Neighborhood Council movement. And so I want to thank all of you, all of those board members and stakeholders who are actively involved in neighborhood councils throughout this city. You're genuinely making a difference, and I'll still continue to work with you, of course, and stand up for you and fight hard for this mission of neighborhood empowerment. I'll just be doing it wearing a different hat, and let me tell you what a privilege it's been to serve all of you in this capacity. So thank you all very, very much.
Councilman, if I may, just join the chorus in thanking you. I appreciated being in this committee, short-lived, but I do know that without your strong staff support, they work very well with my staff, and I want to thank them for being so obliging and resourceful in dealing with these very difficult issues, and for your stewardship, the calm voice, analytical approach, looking for solutions, does help for an environment that is healthy, given all the different push and pull factors that exist in a very diverse city. So again, I want to thank Bonk as well, but thank you, sir, and I have a funny feeling a lot of this work's going to end up in another committee.
I'm guessing
for
so.
some reason. I want to lose the chair on that one. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reyes, very much. All right, so that brings us to general public comment. Thank you all for that indulgence. Our first speaker will be Ida Talala, followed by Nina Royal.
Thank you very much for the many opportunities I've had to voice my concerns, many of which is as a result of grave concerns about how the community is being served. In terms of fundraising, one of the speakers from the Neighborhood Council indicated, take a good look. Neighborhood councils have become a challenge to ordinary neighborhood groups. They've become rivals. They've gone in there and taken over activities that rightfully belong to groups that have been working at it for a long time. They've muscled their way in. They've also gone to take donations for food and things that normally have gone to other groups. So it's become even harder for local groups to function because the neighborhood council has gone in and taken that donation. There is also, so be very careful. The neighborhood council gets a finite amount of money, let them use it. Let them use it responsibly and prudently. And that's all their purview is, not to go out there and raise funds. And challenge local groups who could do it even better. Again, I would like to bring this issue of grievances It needs to be dealt with as soon as possible. I also think that this issue of what constitutes having a grievance dealt with by a neighborhood council and have them report to Dunn is unfair to the public and to myself as a stakeholder, because I have never been before a grievance panel, and I stand by it.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Nina Royal, followed by Commissioner Eberhardt. Welcome.
Welcome, thank you. Ditto, you've been a great friend in neighborhood councils, and we appreciate it very much, and we're happy that you're going to continue supporting us. In my opinion, there's more right about neighborhood councils than there is wrong. And I would really like to congratulate my neighborhood council members here who spoke so eloquently and actually said everything that I would like to have said. So that's why I waited for general comment, because I knew that I could count on them to get the message across. However, there's one thing I do want to bring up. Because of the funding is being reduced, committee chairs like myself for our safety committee, I couldn't put on our safety fair this year because lack of funds. Everything now the city is charging for permits and what have you, and we did not budget it. And if we do budget it for the next year, because of the fact that we have so much money going out just in administrative cost, that money is not going to be there. So I am asking you to take that into consideration when you are doing your funding request. Outreach. I would like to see outreach be more done by the city, like maybe through the Department of Water and Power, because that is so important. The first obligation of neighborhood councils is to do outreach, not so much community improvement, that type of thing. That's what we're here for. We're to bring the message from you to our community back to you. So that's extremely important that we have the funds to be able to do that. And personally, I know what it's like to walk community streets trying to get the information out, and it is very difficult. Not everybody yet in my generation is computer literate. I'm not saying I'm not, but I'm just saying that they are not. So you need to keep that into your purview. Anyway, thank you so much. Elections are great. Let us do our own. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Doug Eberhardt, followed by Glenn Bailey.
Since I'm here, I thought I'd give you a quick report on what the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners has been up to. At the meeting in January, we passed a 4-part work plan for this year, 2012, consisting of 4 areas to focus on. The first being creating a series of standards, which we will then use and the department to judge, how well neighborhood councils are doing. We're trying to move away from a lot of specific rulemaking because the neighborhood councils do things differently, but it doesn't mean that one way of doing things is better or worse than another as long as they meet minimal standards. That work has already begun with that committee. The second is, as I'd mentioned, to really start to develop a leadership training program, if nothing else, to start to pull together the pieces that are already happening. The third item has to do with working on a citywide outreach and publicity campaign, which is really built around message. There's a lot of talk about, billboards and bus benches and whatever, and very little about the message. And I think we have great people and we have a great message, and we just need to figure out, the 4 or 5 word slogan to convey that. And then finally, we've put together a committee which will probably do most of its work toward the end of this year to take a look at the ordinance, which is our plan for neighborhood councils. A comprehensive look with an eye toward proposing a series of recommendations to update it. Include some things that probably should be there and aren't there, maybe take out some things that are there that shouldn't be there. So, and this follows along with your recommendations, the motions that were proposed. So the idea is to kind of work in concert, and we've done a lot of time consulting with the department. Gracie and Bong. I drag them to lunch occasionally. And also with the neighborhood councils. We'll be doing a lot more stuff out there on the road this year.
Great.
Oh, one other thing. Neighborhood council elections. Rather than setting up some sort of separate bonk committee, we appointed a couple of delegates to work with the elections task force that the neighborhood councils are running so that we're all in the same room at the same time doing the same thing.
Excellent. Great. Thank you very much, Commissioner. Our next speaker is Glenn Bailey, followed by Tony Wilkinson.
Glenn Bailey, I said in my initial comments my acknowledgement and appreciation of your leadership, but I ditto to Mr. Kim said it much more eloquently. I wanted to give you a send-off to Budget and Finance of one issue. The rollover monies that come from neighborhood councils could be used as a source of funding the neighborhood council elections. By my rough calculations, there should be enough money to pay for that item, which I understand was put into the budget request. I don't know the exact dollar amount, but it seems to me, since it's already been allocated, not spent, and because we do have a financial situation in the city, that it could be, through the budgetary process, used for our, quote, 2012 elections, but it's next fiscal year. Secondly, just to add a little bit to Commissioner Eberhardt's thought regarding a $1 per resident funding level, just to bring it home for the Valley, 34 neighborhood councils, the largest of which, not by much, just a few hundred, is Sylmar at 78,862 based on the most recent census. The smallest in population is 11,887, Greater Toluca Lake. Think of the socioeconomic differences between those two communities. And I'm not picking on anyone. I'm just saying there is a variation there that maybe should be looked at. And my last comment was earlier this morning, the Board of Recreation and Parks Commissioner passed a trash fee that they're going to be imposing upon all park users. Every youth group, every sport group, and big special events, which is, I think, appropriate because many of them are profit-making. But this was done without notifying the neighborhood councils and any of our groups that work with us. As far as I know, any of the park advisory boards. This is not good way for Recreation and Parks to roll out a citywide new fee for all park users throughout the city without doing appropriate notification outreach like I think they should do. Thank you.
Thank you. And our final speaker is Tony Wilkinson.
Who just wants to say thank you very much for just a wonderful tour with Education, Neighborhoods, Arts and Parks. But one of the things, just as we had our discussion today, I'm excited about what I see happening in this city. Unfortunately, it's under duress because there's so many painful things for city employees and for the services to the public that are having to be cut. But I'm beginning to see a lot of people really talking with each other about issues. I mean, I really appreciate Councilmember Reyes is bringing up issues. What are neighborhood councils about? Doug's comments on that too. And in ways that we're discussing, even if we disagree with things, me or BH, we're talking about an issue, not a person. And I see this across the board. I see this in our discussion this morning about the Department of Water and Power. I think they really have a new approach to how to get along with the elected officials and the public. So I know it's tough times, but I'm really excited, and I thank both of you gentlemen for being part of this real change that I think is going on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilkinson. Thank you, everyone. This meeting is adjourned.